The Arizona Territory in 1882 was a land where legends were born and dreams were buried beneath layers of red dust and scorching sun. It was a place where the line between hero and outlaw could blur as quickly as a desert mirage, and where a single moment could change the course of two lives forever. The Butterfield Overland Mail stagecoach rolled across the rugged terrain like a ship navigating treacherous waters. Its wheels kicked up clouds of dust that painted everything in shades of amber and rust. Inside the swaying coach, passengers gripped their seats as the vehicle bounced over rocks and ruts that served as roads in this untamed wilderness. Among the passengers sat Miss Eleanor Ellie Whitmore, a 22-year-old woman whose refined features and expensive traveling dress marked her as someone from the civilized East. Her dark hair was pinned back in the latest fashion, though several rebellious strands had worked loose during the long journey. Her green eyes held a spark of determination that suggested she was more than just another well-bred lady seeking adventure in the Wild West. Ellie was traveling to Tombstone, Arizona, where her father, Judge Harold Whitmore, had been appointed to bring law and order to one of the most notorious mining towns in the territory. The silver mines of Tombstone had made some men rich and others desperate, creating a powder keg of violence that needed a firm judicial hand. "How much further to Tombstone?" asked Mrs. Catherine Miller, a plump widow clutching her reticule as if it contained the crown jewels. She had been asking the same question every few miles for the past 2 hours. "About 15 miles, ma'am," replied Tom Harrison, the shotgun messenger who rode alongside the driver. His weathered face had seen countless journeys across this dangerous country, and his keen eyes constantly scanned the horizon for trouble. The double-barreled shotgun across his lap wasn't just for show. In this part of Arizona, stagecoach robberies were as common as rattlesnakes. The third passenger was Samuel Brennan, a traveling merchant whose samples case contained everything from patent medicines to fancy buttons. He mopped his brow with a handkerchief and muttered about the uncivilized conditions of frontier travel. High above them, perched on the driver's seat, sat Whip McGillicuddy, whose real name was Thomas but whose skill with the reins and his famous bullwhip had earned him his nickname. At 62, Whip had been driving stagecoaches since before the Civil War, and there wasn't a road, trail, or shortcut in the Southwest that he didn't know by heart. "Easy there, girls," Whip called to his 6-horse team as they approached a narrow canyon known locally as Devil's Gateway. The horses were Whip's pride and joy, 2 lead horses, 2 swing horses, and 2 wheel horses, all carefully selected for their strength, speed, and temperament. He knew each one by name. Thunder and Lightning were his leads, Storm and Gale his swing horses, and Rock and Boulder brought up the rear as wheel horses. The canyon walls rose on either side like ancient guardians, their red sandstone faces carved by millions of years of wind and water. Shadows danced across the rock formations, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that made even seasoned travelers feel small and vulnerable. It was in this very canyon, according to local Apache legend, that the spirits of ancient warriors still roamed, protecting hidden treasures and sacred places from those who would disturb them. The Apache people had traveled these paths for centuries before the first Spanish explorers arrived, and their knowledge of the land was deeper than any map could show. As the stagecoach wound its way through Devil's Gateway, Ellie found herself mesmerized by the dramatic landscape. Back in Boston, she had read about the American West in newspapers and dime novels, but nothing had prepared her for the raw beauty and harsh majesty of the Arizona Territory. The air itself seemed different here, thinner, cleaner, charged with possibility and danger. "First time in Arizona Territory, miss?" Tom Harrison asked, noticing her wide-eyed fascination. "Yes," Ellie replied, pressing her face closer to the window. "It's so different from anything I've ever seen. So wild and free." Tom smiled. "That it is, miss. But don't let the beauty fool you. This country can kill a man, or woman, faster than you can blink if you don't respect it. And there's more than just the land to worry about out here." As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the canyon that made every passenger's blood run cold, the distinctive whistle of the Crimson Riders. The whistle came again, higher pitched this time, bouncing off the canyon walls like a bird of prey's cry. Tom Harrison's knuckles went white as he gripped his shotgun tighter. Above them, Whip McGillicuddy suddenly urged his horses to move faster. "What's that sound?" Mrs. Miller asked, her voice trembling. Before Tom could answer, riders appeared on the canyon rim above them. 5 men on horseback, their faces covered with red bandanas, their horses dancing with barely contained energy. These were the infamous Crimson Riders, the most feared outlaw gang in the Arizona Territory. "Hold up there, Whip," shouted the lead rider, his voice carrying easily through the canyon air. He was tall and lean, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. Even with his face covered, there was something commanding about his presence, something that spoke of natural leadership and quiet confidence. This was Jake, the Shadow Morrison, though none in the Stagecoach knew his real name. At 28, he had been riding the outlaw trail for 6 years, ever since a corrupt sheriff had murdered his father and stolen their family ranch. What had started as a quest for justice had evolved into something more complicated, a reputation that made him both feared and, in some circles, admired. "Can't do that, boys," Whip called back, cracking his whip above the horses' heads. "Got passengers and schedule to keep." But even as he spoke, more riders appeared, blocking the path ahead. The Crimson Riders had chosen their spot well. Devil's Gateway was a natural trap, with high walls on both sides and limited escape routes. "Easy now," Jake called out, his voice steady and calm. Unlike many outlaws who used fear and violence as their primary tools, Jake Morrison had a code. He never killed unless absolutely necessary, never harmed women or children, and always left his victims with enough money to get home safely. It was this code that had earned him a grudging respect even among some lawmen. The stagecoach slowed to a halt, the horses snorting and stamping nervously. Dust swirled in the canyon air, and the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. "Nobody needs to get hurt here," Jake continued, his eyes meeting Tom Harrison's. "We're just interested in what the strongbox is carrying. Cooperate and everyone goes home safe." Tom looked up at Whip, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The old driver had survived 30 years on dangerous roads by knowing when to fight and when to fold. With riders above and below and innocent passengers depending on him, this was clearly a time for discretion. "All right, boys," Tom called out, slowly setting his shotgun aside. "But you should know there ain't much in that strongbox worth dying over." Jake dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the canyon floor with barely a sound. He was dressed in black leather chaps, a dark blue shirt and a worn leather vest. His gun belt sat low on his hips, and the pearl-handled Colt .45 it held had seen plenty of use but was clearly well maintained. As Jake approached the stagecoach, Ellie found herself studying him intently. Despite the red bandana covering the lower half of his face, she could see his eyes, deep blue, intelligent, and surprisingly gentle. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that suggested education and breeding rather than the rough background she would have expected from an outlaw. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat politely, "I apologize for the inconvenience. This won't take long." His voice was cultured, with just a hint of a southern accent. Not at all what Ellie had expected from a desperado. She watched, fascinated despite her fear, as he examined the strongbox with the expertise of someone who had done this many times before. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Mrs. Miller, "I'll need you to hand over that reticule. But don't worry, I'll be leaving you with traveling money." Mrs. Miller, trembling like a leaf in a windstorm, handed over her purse. True to his word, Jake opened it, removed most of the contents, then handed it back with several bills still inside. "For your trouble, ma'am," he said courteously. When he turned to Samuel Brennan, the merchant was already extending his wallet with shaking hands. Again Jake took most but not all, leaving enough for the man to continue his journey. Finally he approached Ellie. Their eyes met, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither spoke. Ellie felt her heart beating so loudly she was sure everyone in the canyon could hear it. There was something in Jake's eyes, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even recognition, though they had never met before. "Miss," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been with the others, "I'm afraid I'll need your jewelry and any money you're carrying." Ellie's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, a gift from her late mother. The movement wasn't lost on Jake, who seemed to understand its significance. "The locket can stay," he said quietly. "A lady should keep her memories." As Ellie handed over her purse and the expensive bracelet from her wrist, their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, sending a shock through both of them that had nothing to do with the dry canyon air. For that brief moment, the outlaw and the judge's daughter existed in a world apart from the robbery, the other passengers, and their very different destinies. "Thank you," Ellie whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Jake stepped back, clearly shaken by the encounter. He had robbed dozens of stagecoaches over the years, but something about this woman, her courage, her dignity, the spark of defiance in her green eyes, had affected him in a way he didn't understand. "Ride on," he called to Whip, his voice not quite as steady as before. "And drive safe, there are dangerous men in these parts." As the stagecoach lurched back into motion, Ellie turned to look back through the rear window. Jake Morrison stood in the dusty road, watching them go, his red bandana now pulled down to reveal a strong jaw and surprisingly gentle mouth. Even at a distance she could feel the weight of his gaze. The other Crimson Riders had already melted away into the canyon shadows, but Jake remained motionless until the stagecoach disappeared around a bend. Only then did he remount his horse, a magnificent black stallion named Midnight, and ride away into the maze of canyons that had hidden him and his men for the past 3 years. Neither Jake nor Ellie could have known in that moment that their brief encounter would set in motion events that would challenge everything they believed about right and wrong, love and loyalty, and the price of following one's heart in a world that demanded conformity. The remainder of the journey to Tombstone passed in relative quiet, but the atmosphere inside the stagecoach had changed dramatically. Mrs. Miller clutched her remaining belongings and muttered prayers under her breath, while Samuel Brennan calculated his losses and complained bitterly about the lack of law enforcement in the territory. Ellie, however, found herself strangely quiet, her thoughts returning again and again to the moment when the outlaw's fingers had brushed hers. She told herself it was simply the shock of the robbery, the fear and excitement of her first encounter with real danger. But deep down she knew it was something more, something that both thrilled and frightened her. "You're mighty quiet, miss," Tom Harrison observed as they crested a hill and saw Tombstone spread out before them in the valley below. "Just taking it all in," Ellie replied, grateful for the distraction. Tombstone in 1882 was a boom town in every sense of the word. Silver had been discovered in the nearby Dragoon Mountains just 4 years earlier, and the town had grown from a handful of prospectors' tents to a thriving community of nearly 10,000 people. The main street, Allen Street, bustled with activity even in the late afternoon heat. Saloons, gambling halls, and dance houses competed for space with legitimate businesses like dry goods stores, restaurants, and hotels. The most famous of these establishments was the Birdcage Theater, known throughout the Southwest for its entertainment. Some respectable, some decidedly not. As the stagecoach rolled down Allen Street, Ellie could see cowboys fresh from cattle drives mixing with silver miners, gamblers, merchants, and the occasional respectable family trying to make an honest living in this chaotic environment. The air rang with the sounds of hammers on anvils, piano music from the saloons, and the constant chatter of commerce and conversation. "There's the courthouse," Tom pointed to a 2-story adobe building near the end of the street. "That's where your father will be holding court, miss. And that there's the Grand Hotel, finest accommodations in town." The Grand Hotel was indeed impressive by frontier standards, 3 stories tall with real glass windows and a covered porch that ran the length of the building. A small crowd had gathered in front, and Ellie could see a distinguished-looking man in a black suit standing on the porch steps. "Father," she called out, waving from the stagecoach window. Judge Harold Whitmore was 55 years old, with silver hair and keen gray eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had spent 20 years as a federal judge in Boston before accepting the challenging assignment in Arizona Territory. He was a man who believed deeply in the law and in the importance of bringing civilization to the frontier. "Eleanor," he called back, his face lighting up with genuine joy and relief. "Thank God you've arrived safely. I was beginning to worry." As the stagecoach came to a stop, Judge Whitmore hurried forward to help his daughter down. The reunion was warm and heartfelt, though Ellie noticed her father looked older and more careworn than when she had last seen him 6 months ago. "The journey wasn't too difficult, I hope?" he asked, taking her traveling bag. "Actually, father, we were robbed by the Crimson Riders about 15 miles back," Ellie said, watching his expression change from relief to concern. "Robbed? My dear girl, are you hurt? Was anyone injured?" "No, father, everyone is fine." The leader was quite civilized about it. Almost gentlemanly, if you can believe that. Judge Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Gentlemanly or not, highway robbery is a serious crime. I'll want a full report for the territorial marshal. These Crimson Riders have been terrorizing this area for far too long." As they walked toward the hotel, Judge Whitmore filled Ellie in on the current state of affairs in Tombstone. The town was struggling with growing pains, he explained. While the silver mines had brought prosperity, they had also attracted every kind of criminal and desperado in the Southwest. "There are 2 groups vying for control of the town," he said in a low voice. "The Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, represent law and order, though their methods are sometimes questionable. Then there are the Cowboys, led by men like Ike Clanton and Curly Bill Brocious, who believe might makes right." The tension between these factions had been building for months, Judge Whitmore explained. Just 10 months earlier, in October of 1881, the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral had left 3 men dead and changed the balance of power in Tombstone. The Earp brothers and their friend Doc Holliday had faced off against the Clanton and McClory gangs in a 30-second shootout that would become the stuff of legend. And where do the Crimson Riders fit into all this? Ellie asked as they entered the hotel lobby. They're different, her father admitted. They don't seem aligned with either faction. Their leader, this Jake Morrison fellow, appears to have his own code of conduct. Some people almost see him as a folk hero, robbing from the rich, never harming innocents. But make no mistake, Eleanor, he's still a criminal, and it's my job to see him brought to justice. Ellie's room at the Grand Hotel was on the second floor, with a window that looked out over Allen Street. As she unpacked her belongings, she found herself thinking about her father's words. Jake Morrison, so that was the outlaw's name. She repeated it silently to herself, surprised by the way it seemed to linger on her tongue. From her window, she could see the constant flow of life on Tombstone's main street. Cowboys in chaps and spurs walked alongside businessmen in suits and bowler hats. Women in simple prairie dresses hurried past saloon girls in colorful satin gowns. It was a world unlike anything she had known in Boston, a place where the rules seemed different and the possibilities endless. That evening, Judge Whitmore took his daughter to dinner at the Cancan restaurant, one of Tombstone's more respectable establishments. As they dined on surprisingly good beef and vegetables, the judge introduced Ellie to some of the town's leading citizens. Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Dr. George Goodfellow, Judge Whitmore said as a well-dressed man approached their table. Doctor, this is my daughter, Eleanor, just arrived from Boston. Dr. Goodfellow was Tombstone's most prominent physician, a man who had earned his reputation treating everything from gunshot wounds to mining accidents. He was also one of the few people in town who commanded respect from both the Earps and the cowboys. Welcome to Tombstone, Miss Whitmore, Dr. Goodfellow said, tipping his hat. I hope you'll find our little community more civilized than its reputation suggests. Actually, we had quite an introduction to local conditions, Judge Whitmore said grimly. The Crimson Riders robbed Eleanor's Stagecoach this afternoon. Dr. Goodfellow's expression grew serious. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope no one was injured. No, Ellie said quickly. The leader, Morrison, I believe, was quite courteous about it. Almost apologetic. Ah yes, Jake Morrison, Dr. Goodfellow nodded. He's something of an enigma. I've actually treated some of his men over the years. They always pay in cash and never cause trouble in my office. Morrison has a reputation for fairness, even among his enemies. Fairness? Judge Whitmore bristled. The man is a thief and an outlaw. Indeed he is, Dr. Goodfellow agreed diplomatically. But in a place like Tombstone, even our criminals have their own peculiar sense of honor. Morrison has never killed anyone unless they drew on him first, and he's been known to share his earnings with struggling families in the territory. Ellie listened to this exchange with growing fascination. The picture being painted of Jake Morrison was far more complex than she had expected. He wasn't just a common criminal. He seemed to be a man driven by his own moral code, however twisted that code might be by conventional standards. As they finished dinner and prepared to return to the hotel, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around the restaurant, studying the faces of other diners, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling persisted as they walked back along Allen Street. She was right to be cautious. From the shadows across the street, a figure in a dark hat and long coat observed their progress. Jake Morrison had been watching the judge's daughter since her arrival in town, though he couldn't have explained why if asked. Something about their encounter that afternoon had left him unsettled, unable to forget the courage in her green eyes or the way she had looked at him without fear. He told himself it was simple curiosity. He made it his business to know about important people in the territory, and Judge Whitmore was definitely important. The judge's efforts to bring law and order to Arizona could seriously impact Jake's ability to operate freely. But deep down, Jake knew it was more than professional interest. Eleanor Whitmore had affected him in a way no woman ever had, and that realization both intrigued and alarmed him. In his world, emotional attachments were dangerous luxuries that could get a man killed. As the judge and his daughter disappeared into the hotel, Jake melted back into the shadows, his mind already working on plans that had nothing to do with stagecoach robberies or territorial politics, and everything to do with a pair of green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. 3 days after the stagecoach robbery, Jake Morrison sat in his hidden canyon headquarters, studying reports from his men with growing concern. The Crimson Riders' secret base was a natural fortress tucked deep in the Dragoon Mountains, accessible only through a narrow passage that could be defended by 2 men against an army. The hideout consisted of several caves that had been connected and enlarged over the years, first by Apache warriors, then by Spanish treasure hunters, and finally by Jake's gang. There were sleeping quarters, a stable for the horses, and even a small room that served as Jake's office, complete with a desk made from rough-hewn pine and shelves lined with books, an unusual touch for an outlaw hideout. "Boss, we got problems," announced Red Murphy, Jake's second-in-command. Red was a stocky Irishman with a temper to match his hair, but his loyalty to Jake was absolute. The two men had saved each other's lives more than once over the years. "What kind of problems?" Jake asked, looking up from the map he'd been studying. "Word's getting around about that judge's daughter. Some of the boys are saying you went soft during that robbery, that you let her keep too much." Red's voice carried a warning. "And there's talk in town that Judge Whitmore is planning something big, bringing in federal marshals, maybe even the army." Jake leaned back in his chair, considering this information. He had been expecting increased pressure from the law ever since Judge Whitmore's arrival, but the comment about going soft troubled him more than he cared to admit. "I followed the code, same as always," he said finally. "We took what we needed, left them enough to get by. That's how we've always operated." "Yeah, but you gave that Miller woman back more than usual, and the merchant too. And that judge's daughter? Hell, Jake, you barely took anything from her at all." Jake stood and walked to the cave entrance, where he could look out over the vast expanse of Arizona territory spreading below. The truth was, Red was right. He had been unusually generous during that robbery, and it had everything to do with a pair of green eyes and a courage that had impressed him more than he wanted to admit. "What else are you hearing?" he asked, changing the subject. "Well, there's something interesting about the judge's daughter. Seems she's not just another Eastern belle come to visit Daddy. Word is she was studying law back in Boston at some fancy women's college. Real smart from what I hear." This information hit Jake like a physical blow. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just beautiful and brave, she was educated, intelligent, someone who could understand the complexities of law and justice that drove his own internal conflicts. "There's more," Red continued. "She's been asking questions around town. About you specifically." Jake turned sharply. "What kind of questions?" "Nothing dangerous. More like, curious questions. About your background, your reputation. Doc Goodfellow says she seemed real interested when he mentioned you'd never killed a man in cold blood." Before Jake could respond to this disturbing news, another gang member burst into the cave. Tommy the Kid Williams was only 19, but he could ride and shoot better than men twice his age. He joined the Crimson Riders after his family was massacred by renegade Apache, though Jake suspected the boy blamed all Apache for what a few had done. "Boss," Tommy gasped, clearly having ridden hard. "You need to see this. There's trouble in Willowbrook." Willowbrook was a small farming community about 20 miles northwest of Tombstone, one of several settlements that dotted the territory's river valleys. It was also a place where Jake had sent money several times over the past year, helping struggling families through hard times. "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked. "Drought's been bad this year, and now there's a banker from Tucson foreclosing on half the farms. Says they can't make their payments. He's got hired guns with him, mean ones. The Dawson family, the McCalls, old Pete Morrison and his wife, they're all gonna lose everything." Jake's jaw tightened at the mention of Pete Morrison. The old farmer wasn't a relative, but Jake had always felt a kinship with him. Pete was an honest man trying to make a living from hard ground, and his wife Martha had once bandaged Jake's wounded arm without asking questions about how he'd been injured. "How many guns?" Jake asked, his mind already working on a plan. "For maybe 5. Professional hard cases, not local boys." Red stepped forward, reading the look on Jake's face. "Boss, this ain't our usual kind of job. Taking on hired guns to help farmers, that's not robbing stagecoaches. That's something else entirely." Jake knew Red was right, but he also knew he couldn't stand by and watch good people lose their homes to greedy bankers and their hired muscle. It was exactly the kind of injustice that had set him on the outlaw trail in the first place. "Get the men ready," he said finally. "We ride in an hour." "All of us?" Red asked. "No. You, me, Tommy, and Blackjack Smith. 4 against 4 or 5, better odds than we've faced before." As his men prepared for the ride to Willowbrook, Jake found himself thinking once again about Eleanor Whitmore. What would she think of what he was planning? Would she see it as just another criminal act, or would she understand that sometimes a man had to choose between the law and justice? The question bothered him more than it should have, and he forced himself to push it aside as he checked his weapons and saddled Midnight. He had more immediate concerns than the opinions of a judge's daughter, no matter how those green eyes had affected him. But even as the Crimson Riders thundered out of their mountain hideout toward Willowbrook, Jake couldn't entirely banish Eleanor from his thoughts. Somehow, without even trying, she had become a measuring stick against which he judged his actions, a voice of conscience that whispered questions he wasn't ready to answer. Meanwhile, in Tombstone, Eleanor Whitmore was experiencing her own internal conflicts. She had spent the morning helping her father organize his court documents, but her mind kept wandering to the mysterious outlaw who had robbed their stagecoach with such unusual courtesy. "Father," she said finally, looking up from a stack of territorial law books, "tell me more about Jake Morrison." Judge Whitmore peered at her over his spectacles. "Why this sudden interest in a criminal, my dear? I'm trying to understand how someone becomes an outlaw in this territory. Is it always simple greed, or are there other factors?" Her father set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "That's a perceptive question, Eleanor. The truth is, the line between lawman and outlaw can be surprisingly thin out here. Morrison, for instance, wasn't always a criminal." "What do you mean?" "I've been researching his background since I arrived. His real name is Jacob Morrison, and he was born to a respectable ranching family near Tucson. His father was a small rancher trying to make an honest living, but he got crossways with a corrupt sheriff named Black Pete Wilson." Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. "What happened?" "Wilson wanted the Morrison Ranch, good water, fertile land. When Jacob's father refused to sell, Wilson trumped up charges against him. Had him arrested on false accusations of cattle rustling. Jacob was away at school in California at the time, studying to be a lawyer actually." "A lawyer?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Yes." "When Jacob returned and found his father in jail, he tried to work within the system to prove his innocence. But Wilson had bought the local judge, and Jacob's father was convicted on perjured testimony. He died in prison 6 months later. Some say from a beating, though it was officially called a heart attack." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with sympathy. "How terrible. What did Jacob do?" "He challenged Wilson to a fair gunfight, claimed it was a matter of honor. But Wilson was a coward as well as a criminal. He sent 6 men to ambush young Morrison instead. Jacob survived, but barely. When he recovered, he found that Wilson had seized his family's ranch for unpaid taxes and sold it to his cronies. So he turned to crime. So he turned to what he saw as justice. His first robbery was Wilson's personal stagecoach, carrying money the sheriff had stolen from local taxpayers. Morrison took every penny and distributed it back to the families Wilson had cheated. He's been following the same pattern ever since, taking from those he sees as corrupt or greedy, helping those in need." Eleanor sat back, her mind reeling. The story painted Jake Morrison in an entirely different light, not as a common criminal, but as a man driven by a sense of justice that the legal system had failed to provide. "That doesn't excuse his crimes," Judge Whitmore continued, as if reading her thoughts. "The law exists to prevent exactly this kind of vigilante justice. If every man decided for himself what was right and wrong, we'd have chaos." "But what if the law itself is corrupt?" Eleanor asked. "What if the system fails?" Her father studied her carefully. "Then we work to change the system from within. We don't abandon it altogether. That's why I'm here, Eleanor, to prove that justice can prevail through legal means, even on the frontier." Eleanor nodded, but privately she wondered if it was always that simple. Her brief encounter with Jake Morrison had shown her a man who seemed to embody contradictions, gentle yet dangerous, criminal yet principled. He challenged everything she had been taught about right and wrong, law and justice. That afternoon, as she walked along Allen Street doing errands for her father, she found herself studying the faces she passed, wondering which of these people had been helped by Jake Morrison's unusual brand of justice, and which had been harmed by it. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the commotion at the far end of the street. A crowd was gathering around the telegraph office, and she could hear excited voices discussing something that had apparently just happened. "Excuse me," she said to a well-dressed woman standing on the edge of the crowd, "what's all the excitement about?" "Oh, my dear, haven't you heard?" the woman replied, her eyes bright with gossip. "The Crimson Riders struck again, but this time it wasn't a robbery. They rode into Willowbrook and ran off some hired guns who were foreclosing on farms. Didn't take a penny for themselves, just sent those eastern loan sharks packing with their tails between their legs." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Was anyone hurt?" "Not a soul, though I hear there was some shooting. That Morrison fellow and 3 of his men faced down 5 professional gunfighters and never broke a sweat. Some folks are calling him the Robin Hood of Arizona." As Eleanor walked back to the hotel, her mind raced with this new information. Jake Morrison continued to confound her expectations, blurring the lines between heroism and criminality in ways that both troubled and excited her. She didn't know that at that very moment, Jake was making camp in a hidden canyon just 10 miles from Tombstone, staring into a campfire and thinking about green eyes and the impossible gulf that separated an outlaw from a judge's daughter. Neither could have imagined that within days circumstances would conspire to bring them face to face again, under conditions that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. 5 days after the incident at Willowbrook, Eleanor convinced her father to let her ride out to see more of the Arizona territory. The official reason was research. She wanted to understand the land and people her father was meant to serve. The unofficial reason was more complex. She felt stifled by Tombstone's dusty streets and curious stares, and she needed space to think about everything she had learned. "I don't like the idea of you riding alone," Judge Whitmore said over breakfast. "This territory is dangerous, Eleanor. Perhaps Dr. Goodfellow's wife could accompany you." "Father, I'm an excellent horsewoman and I'll stay close to town. Besides, I'll be armed." She patted the small derringer she had taken to carrying in her reticule, a precaution that had become second nature since arriving in Arizona. Reluctantly, Judge Whitmore agreed, though he insisted she take one of the horses from the livery stable rather than venture out on foot. The horse he chose was a gentle mare named Buttercup, reliable but not particularly fast. Exactly the kind of mount he thought appropriate for his daughter's genteel excursion. What Judge Whitmore didn't know was that Eleanor had been an accomplished rider since childhood, equally comfortable on spirited horses or gentle ponies. Buttercup, while sweet-natured, was far too tame for Eleanor's current mood. She rode south from Tombstone, following a well-traveled trail that led toward the Dragoon Mountains. The morning air was crisp and clear, with a kind of brilliant blue sky that seemed to exist only in the American West. Desert wildflowers dotted the landscape in splashes of red, yellow, and purple, and the distant mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the horizon. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, Eleanor felt truly free. Boston seemed like another world, with its rigid social conventions and limited opportunities for women. Here, under the vast western sky, she could imagine different possibilities for her life. She had been riding for about an hour when she heard the sound of gunfire echoing from a canyon to her left. The shots came in rapid succession, the sharp crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper boom of handguns. Someone was in serious trouble. Eleanor's first instinct was to turn back toward town for help, but even as she considered it, she realized that by the time she reached Tombstone and returned with assistance, whatever was happening would be long over. The gunfire was close, perhaps only a few hundred yards away. Against her better judgment, she guided Buttercup toward the sound, dismounting when she reached the canyon's rim and carefully making her way to a position where she could see what was happening below. What she saw made her blood run cold. A lone rider was trapped behind some rocks in the canyon floor, surrounded by 4 men who were methodically closing in on his position. The trapped man's horse lay motionless nearby, clearly shot down to prevent his escape. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized the black clothing and the way the lone rider moved. It was Jake Morrison, and he was in serious danger. The 4 attackers wore the dusty clothes of professional gunmen, and their tactics spoke of military training. They had positioned themselves to cover all possible escape routes, and they were advancing with the patience of men who knew their quarry was trapped. "Give it up, Morrison," one of them called out. "You killed our boss in Willowbrook. Now it's payback time." So these were the hired guns Jake had driven off from the farming community, Eleanor realized. They had followed him here seeking revenge, and they had him cornered like a fox in a den. Jake's response was a carefully aimed shot that sent one of the attackers diving for cover. His marksmanship was impressive, but Eleanor could see that his ammunition wouldn't last forever. The 4 men had him outgunned and surrounded. It was only a matter of time. Eleanor found herself faced with an impossible choice. The logical thing to do was ride back to town and let justice take its course. Jake Morrison was an outlaw, and these men, however unsavory, were attempting to arrest or eliminate a known criminal. But the woman who had listened to Jake's story, who had seen the gentle courtesy he showed to Stagecoach passengers and the way he defended struggling farmers, couldn't simply ride away and let him be murdered, for she had no doubt that these men intended to kill him rather than capture him. Her mind raced through possibilities. She was one woman with a small derringer against 4 professional gunmen. Direct intervention was suicide. But perhaps there was another way. Quietly, she led Buttercup back from the canyon rim and rode hard toward the main trail. When she encountered a group of cowboys heading toward Tombstone, she flagged them down with urgent waves. "Please, you have to help," she called out. "There are men with guns in Willow Canyon. I heard shooting. Someone may be hurt." The cowboys, recognizing her as Judge Whitmore's daughter, immediately spurred their horses toward the canyon. Eleanor followed at a distance, her heart pounding with hope and fear. By the time the cowboys reached the canyon, the gunfight was over. 3 of the hired guns lay dead, victims of Jake's superior marksmanship and tactical position. The 4th had fled when he realized the odds had turned against him. Jake Morrison was wounded, a bullet crease along his left arm that bled freely but wasn't immediately dangerous. He was reloading his Colt when the cowboys appeared at the canyon rim, and for a tense moment, Eleanor thought there might be more violence. But these were working cowboys, not gunfighters, and they had no particular quarrel with the Crimson Riders. In fact, some of them had benefited from Jake's generosity over the years. "You okay down there, Morrison?" called out Frank Butler, the group's leader. "I'll live," Jake replied, binding his wounded arm with a strip torn from his shirt. "Thanks for the timely arrival." "Don't thank us. Thank the lady there." Frank nodded toward Eleanor, who had approached the canyon rim despite her better judgment. Jake looked up and their eyes met across the distance. Even wounded and covered in dust, he was still the most compelling man Eleanor had ever seen. The gratitude in his blue eyes was mixed with something else: surprise, confusion, and a warmth that made her heart race. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the canyon air. "I'm in your debt." "I couldn't just ride away," she replied, amazed at her own boldness. "No one deserves to be murdered, whatever their circumstances." The cowboys helped Jake retrieve his saddle and what supplies he could carry from his dead horse. One of them, a young man named Billy, offered to let Jake ride double with him to wherever he was headed. "I can make it on my own," Jake said, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to stay upright. "The hell you can," Frank Butler said bluntly. "You're bleeding like a stuck pig and there might be more of those hired guns around. Billy, get him up behind you and take him wherever he needs to go." As the group prepared to separate, the cowboys heading back to their work, Jake departing for parts unknown, Eleanor found herself overcome by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, "your wound needs proper attention. I have some medical supplies with me." It was true. She had taken to carrying a small medical kit after hearing about the various dangers of frontier life. But offering to treat an outlaw's wounds went far beyond simple humanitarian concern. Jake studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of accepting her offer. Finally, he nodded to Billy, who helped him dismount in a small grove of cottonwood trees about a mile from the canyon. The cowboys tactfully withdrew, giving Eleanor and Jake a measure of privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if trouble arose. Frank Butler positioned himself where he could watch the trail for other riders, while the rest of the men tended to their horses and checked their weapons. Eleanor approached Jake with her medical kit, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She had assisted doctors in Boston during her volunteer work at charity hospitals, but treating a wounded outlaw in the Arizona wilderness was far outside her experience. "Let me see that arm," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Jake shrugged out of his shirt, revealing a lean, muscular torso marked with several old scars that spoke of a violent life. The bullet wound was a clean graze along the outside of his left bicep, painful and bloody, but not life-threatening. "You've been shot before," Eleanor observed, noting the way he endured her ministrations without flinching. "Occupational hazard," Jake replied with a wry smile. "Though I try to avoid it when possible." Eleanor cleaned the wound with water from her canteen, then applied a salve she had learned to make from desert plants. Her hands were steady, but she was acutely aware of Jake's proximity, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, of the way he watched her face as she worked. "Why did you help me?" he asked quietly. "Your father is a federal judge. I'm an outlaw with a price on my head. By rights, you should have let those men finish what they started." Eleanor paused in her bandaging, considering her answer. Because what they were doing wasn't justice. It was murder. And because... She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Because I don't think you're the villain everyone makes you out to be," she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. "A real villain wouldn't have let me keep my mother's locket. A real villain wouldn't risk his life to save farmers from hired guns." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "You don't know what you're saying, Miss Whitmore. I've done things, broken laws, hurt people. The fact that I try to follow a code doesn't change that." "Maybe not," Eleanor replied, finishing the bandage and stepping back. "But it doesn't change the fact that you saved those families in Willowbrook either. Sometimes the world isn't as simple as the law books make it seem." Their conversation was interrupted by Frank Butler's warning whistle. A dust cloud on the horizon indicated approaching riders, quite a few of them moving fast. "Time to go," Jake said, accepting Billy's help in mounting behind the young cowboy. "Miss Whitmore, I meant what I said. I'm in your debt. If you ever need anything, just try to stay alive," Eleanor said, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "The world has too few people willing to stand up for what's right, even if they do it in unconventional ways." Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both farewell and promise. "Until we meet again, Miss Eleanor Whitmore." As the cowboys rode away, taking Jake to safety, Eleanor remained in the grove of cottonwoods, watching them disappear into the vast Arizona landscape. She knew she should feel guilty about helping a known criminal escape justice. Instead, she felt something she had never experienced before, the exhilarating sense that she had followed her heart rather than her head, and that the choice had been the right one regardless of what the law might say. The approaching riders proved to be a posse led by Sheriff Johnny Bean, drawn by reports of gunfire. When they questioned Eleanor about what she had seen, she told them truthfully about the gunfight, omitting only the part about Jake's escape and her role in treating his wounds. 4 professional gunfighters against 1 man, Sheriff Bean mused, studying the scene. "Morrison's getting too dangerous to leave running loose. It's time we organized a serious effort to bring him in." Eleanor said nothing, but her heart sank at the sheriff's words. She had saved Jake's life today, but she had also put him in greater danger by demonstrating just how formidable an opponent he could be. As she rode back to Tombstone that evening, Eleanor realized that her life had taken a turn from which there might be no returning. She was no longer simply Judge Whitmore's daughter, come to observe frontier justice from a safe distance. She had become an active participant in the complex moral landscape of the Arizona Territory, and her heart had chosen its side regardless of what her head might counsel. The question now was what she would do with that knowledge, and whether she would have the courage to follow where it led. The days following Eleanor's encounter with Jake in the canyon passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension. On the surface, she resumed her routine of helping her father with court business and exploring Tombstone's social landscape. Beneath that facade, however, she found herself constantly alert for news of Jake Morrison and the Crimson Riders. Sheriff Bean had indeed organized a more intensive effort to capture the outlaw gang. Wanted posters appeared throughout the territory, offering a reward of $500 for Jake Morrison, dead or alive. The amount was substantial enough to attract bounty hunters from as far away as California and Texas. "It's getting dangerous for Morrison," Dr. Goodfellow confided to Eleanor during a chance meeting at the general store. "Every desperate man with a gun is going to be looking for that reward money. And some of these bounty hunters aren't particular about bringing their quarry back alive." Eleanor felt a chill at his words, but she forced herself to maintain a calm demeanor. "I suppose it's what he should expect, given his chosen profession." "Perhaps," Dr. Goodfellow agreed. "Though I can't help but think that a man with Morrison's education and natural leadership abilities might have made quite a contribution to society under different circumstances." That evening, as Eleanor sat on the hotel's front porch watching the sun set over the desert, she was approached by a young Mexican boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. "Señorita Whitmore?" he said in accented but clear English. "Yes. I have a message for you." He handed her a folded piece of paper, then quickly disappeared into the crowd on Allen Street before she could question him further. Eleanor's heart raced as she opened the note. The handwriting was educated, with the flowing script of someone who had spent considerable time with books and formal learning. "Miss Whitmore, I hope this finds you well and in good health. I wanted to express my gratitude once more for your assistance during our recent encounter. Your kindness and courage will not be forgotten. I also wanted to warn you that your involvement, however innocent, may have been noticed by those who would use it against your father. Please be careful and trust no one completely, even those who claim to serve the law. If you are ever in danger and cannot turn to conventional sources of help, leave a white ribbon tied to the hitching post outside the Birdcage Theater. Someone will watch for such a signal and respond accordingly. Your servant, Jim." Eleanor read the note twice, then carefully folded it and slipped it into her bodice. The implications were troubling. Jake was suggesting that her father's enemies might try to use her connection to the outlaw gang against Judge Whitmore. It was a possibility she hadn't considered, but it made sense given the political complexities of territorial justice. She was still pondering the note's contents when her father emerged onto the porch, looking tired and frustrated. "Difficult day?" she asked. "More than you know," Judge Whitmore replied, settling into the chair beside her. "I've been hearing rumors that concern me greatly. There are suggestions that some of the local law enforcement officials have been Compromised. What do you mean? Corruption, Eleanor. Sheriff Bean, for instance, has been accused of taking money from cattle rustlers and claim jumpers. And there are questions about the previous judge's sudden departure from the territory. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. This sounded very much like the situation Jake had described regarding his father's persecution by the corrupt Sheriff Wilson. What will you do about it? She asked. My job, Judge Whitmore said firmly. I'll investigate these allegations, and if they prove true, I'll see that justice is served. But it won't be easy, and it won't make me popular with certain elements in the territory. That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking about Jake's warning and her father's words. If Judge Whitmore was indeed threatening corrupt officials, those officials would be looking for ways to discredit or eliminate him. And what better way than to implicate his daughter in consorting with known criminals? The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through Tombstone. The westbound stagecoach had been robbed again, but this time the crime bore none of the hallmarks of the Crimson Rider's usual methods. The passengers had been terrorized, one had been beaten, and the strongbox had been destroyed with dynamite rather than simply opened. Most disturbing of all, the robbers had worn red bandanas in an apparent attempt to implicate Jake Morrison's gang. It's a crude frame-up, Dr. Goodfellow told Judge Whitmore during an emergency meeting in the courthouse. Morrison's men don't use dynamite, and they certainly don't beat passengers. Someone's trying to pin this on the Crimson Riders. But who? Judge Whitmore asked. And why? Eleanor, who was present at the meeting as her father's assistant, thought she knew the answer but couldn't voice it without revealing her communication with Jake. Someone was trying to escalate the manhunt for the Crimson Riders, possibly to distract attention from other criminal activities. Sheriff Bean arrived at the courthouse with a swagger that suggested he had important news to share. Judge Whitmore, I've got reliable information about Morrison's whereabouts. My sources tell me he's been seen near the old Spanish mine up in Ghost Canyon. What sources? Dr. Goodfellow asked skeptically. Professional informants, Bean replied vaguely. Men who know the territory and the people in it. Eleanor studied the sheriff's face and didn't like what she saw. There was something too eager in his expression, something that suggested personal interest beyond simply doing his job. I'm organizing a large posse, Bean continued. 20 men well-armed and experienced. We'll corner Morrison and his gang in that canyon and end this threat once and for all. Sheriff, Judge Whitmore said carefully, I want Morrison brought in for trial, not killed in a gunfight. He deserves his day in court like any other citizen. Bean's smile was cold. Of course, Judge. But if Morrison resists arrest, well, a man has to protect himself. After Bean left, Eleanor excused herself and went for a walk to clear her head. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the hour, and she felt helpless to prevent what seemed like an inevitable tragedy. She was passing the Birdcage Theater when she noticed a white ribbon tied to the hitching post, her own white ribbon, which she had placed there that morning on impulse, hoping against hope that Jake's message system actually worked. As she watched from across the street, a figure emerged from the shadows beside the theater. It was a woman dressed in the practical clothes of a frontier settler, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Casual air of someone making a chance social contact. Miss Whitmore? I'm Martha Peterson. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance who suggested we might want to talk. Eleanor's pulse quickened. I'm not sure what you mean. Ghost Canyon, Martha said quietly. Your father's friend the sheriff is planning a visit there tomorrow. Our mutual acquaintance thought you should know that Ghost Canyon is a box canyon with only one way in or out. Anyone trapped there would have no chance of escape. The implication was clear. Sheriff Bean was planning an ambush, not an arrest. Eleanor felt sick at the thought of what would happen to Jake and his men if they were indeed hiding in Ghost Canyon. What can be done? Eleanor asked, abandoning any pretense of not understanding. Information has a way of traveling in the desert, Martha replied. Sometimes people learn about danger in time to avoid it. But such warnings need to be timely. Eleanor understood. If Jake was to be warned about the trap, it had to happen today before Bean's posse could reach Ghost Canyon. How? She asked simply. There's a telegraph line that runs to the mining camps in the Dragoons. Messages sometimes get sent to the wrong places, if you understand my meaning. A message warning of a mining accident in Ghost Canyon might reach the right people. Eleanor nodded, her mind already working on the details. I'll need to send it myself to ensure it goes to the right mining office. Martha smiled approvingly. The telegraph office stays open until sunset. And Miss Whitmore? Our mutual acquaintance wanted you to know that your kindness has not gone unnoticed. There are people in this territory who remember their debts. As Martha disappeared back into the shadows, Eleanor realized she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Sending a warning to Jake Morrison would make her an active accomplice to his escape from justice. It would betray her father's trust and potentially destroy everything Judge Whitmore was trying to accomplish in Arizona territory. But the alternative was to stand by and watch while men were murdered in cold blood by a corrupt sheriff who was using the law as a cover for his own criminal agenda. Eleanor walked to the telegraph office with steady steps, her mind clear despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Love, she realized, wasn't always about romance and stolen kisses. Sometimes it was about making impossible choices and accepting the consequences, whatever they might be. As she composed the telegram warning of a dangerous mining situation in Ghost Canyon, Eleanor Whitmore officially became an outlaw herself, bound by ties of conscience and affection to a man she barely knew but couldn't abandon to the false justice of corrupt men. The message went out just as the sun touched the horizon, carrying with it Eleanor's heart and her commitment to a path that would test everything she thought she knew about right, wrong, and the courage required to follow one's conscience in an imperfect world. Jake Morrison received Eleanor's warning just as he and his men were preparing to break camp in a canyon 5 miles from Ghost Canyon. The coded message, delivered by a sympathetic telegraph operator from the mining camp, was brief but clear. Dangerous mining conditions expected in Ghost Canyon area. Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel. Red Murphy looked up from cleaning his rifle as Jake studied the telegram. What's the word, boss? We've got a guardian angel, Jake replied, his voice mixing gratitude with something deeper. Someone just warned us about a trap. Jake's mind immediately went to Eleanor Whitmore. The timing, the method, and the careful phrasing all suggested her involvement. But why would a federal judge's daughter risk everything to save an outlaw she barely knew? Change of plans, he announced to his men. We're moving deeper into the mountains. Tommy, you and Blackjack take the spare horses and set up a cold camp in Cedar Canyon. Rhett, you're with me. We're going to do some scouting. Where we heading, boss? Red asked as he secured his gear. To see just how big this trap was supposed to be, Jake replied grimly. That evening, from a concealed position high in the rocks above Ghost Canyon, Jake and Red watched Sheriff Bean's posse take up positions around the canyon's single entrance. 20 men, just as the sheriff had promised, armed with rifles and enough ammunition for a small war. They're not planning on taking prisoners, Red observed quietly. Jake nodded, studying the sheriff's deployment through a small telescope. Bean's got orders to make sure I don't make it to trial. The question is, who's giving those orders? The answer came sooner than expected. As Jake watched, another rider approached the posse's position. A well-dressed man on an expensive horse, someone who clearly wasn't part of the regular law enforcement effort. Well, I'll be damned, Red breathed as Jake passed him the telescope. That's Judge Morrison's replacement, Judge Blackwood, the man your father was convicted by. Jake's blood ran cold. Judge Cornelius Blackwood was the corrupt official who had sentenced Jake's father to prison on false charges 6 years ago. The man who had made it possible for Sheriff Wilson to steal the Morrison ranch. So that's what this is about, Jake murmured. Blackwood's worried that Judge Whitmore is going to investigate the old cases. He needs me dead so I can't testify about what really happened to my father. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Judge Blackwood had been taking bribes and perverting justice for years, but Judge Whitmore's reputation for integrity threatened to expose the entire corrupt system. Eliminating Jake Morrison would remove the most credible witness to Blackwood's crimes. What do we do, boss? Red asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the men below who were prepared to murder him to protect their secrets. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with cold determination. We're going to give Judge Whitmore the evidence he needs to clean house in this territory. But first, we need to get back to town without getting ourselves killed. The journey back to Tombstone took most of the night, using trails known only to Apache scouts and experienced outlaws. As they rode, Jake found himself thinking about Eleanor Whitmore and the risk she had taken to warn him. Her courage had saved his life, but it had also put her in terrible danger. If Judge Blackwood suspected that Eleanor was in communication with the Crimson Riders, he wouldn't hesitate to use that knowledge against Judge Whitmore. Corruption had a way of protecting itself by destroying anyone who threatened to expose it. Red, Jake said as they approached the outskirts of Tombstone, I want you to take the boys and head for the old hideout in Mexico. Lay low until you hear from me. What about you? I've got some unfinished business in town. Someone saved my life today, and I need to make sure they don't pay too high a price for that kindness. Red studied his friend's face in the moonlight. Boss, you're talking about the judge's daughter, aren't you? You can't be thinking of. I'm thinking of keeping her alive, Jake said firmly. Which means I need to get her father the evidence that will put Blackwood and his cronies behind bars before they decide she knows too much. And how exactly are you planning to do that? Walk up to Judge Whitmore and introduce yourself? Hello, Your Honor, I'm the outlaw you've been trying to arrest, but I'd like to help you with your corruption investigation. Jake smiled grimly. Something like that. Meanwhile, in Tombstone, Eleanor was pacing her hotel room like a caged animal. She had sent the warning, but she had no way of knowing whether Jake had received it in time. The uncertainty was driving her to distraction. A soft knock at her door interrupted her worried thoughts. Eleanor, her father's voice called. May I come in? Of course, father. Eleanor quickly checked to make sure Jake's note was still safely hidden before opening the door. Judge Whitmore entered, looking more troubled than Eleanor had ever seen him. I've just received some disturbing news from the territorial capital. There have been allegations made about your activities since arriving in Arizona. Eleanor's heart sank. What kind of allegations? Someone has suggested that you've been in communication with criminal elements, specifically with Jake Morrison and his gang. Judge Whitmore studied his daughter's face carefully. Eleanor, I need you to tell me the truth. Have you had any contact with Morrison beyond that initial robbery? Eleanor faced the moment of truth she had been dreading. She could lie to her father, maintain her pretense of innocence, and hope that her secret activities never came to light. Or she could trust him with the truth and hope that his love for her was stronger than his commitment to the law. Yes, she said simply. I have. Judge Whitmore closed his eyes briefly as if absorbing a physical blow. Tell me everything. Eleanor did, beginning with her encounter with the wounded Jake in the canyon and ending with the warning she had sent about Ghost Canyon. She watched her father's expression change from disappointment to concern to something that might have been grudging admiration. Eleanor, he said when she finished, do you realize what you've done? You've aided a known criminal, interfered with law enforcement, and potentially compromised my position as a federal judge. Yes, father, I know. But I also know that Sheriff Bean was planning to murder Jake Morrison rather than arrest him. And I believe that someone is using the law itself as a weapon to protect their own criminal activities. Judge Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the lights of Tombstone. What makes you think that? He asked finally. Things Jake told me about his father's case. Things you've mentioned about corruption in the territorial justice system. The way that Stagecoach robbery was handled, it was designed to make Jake look worse, not to actually catch him. You're asking me to trust the word of an outlaw over that of sworn law enforcement officers. I'm asking you to investigate the possibility that some of those sworn officers might not be worthy of your trust. Judge Whitmore turned back to his daughter, and Eleanor was surprised to see something like pride in his eyes along with the worry and frustration. You know, he said slowly, your mother would have done exactly the same thing. She never could stand by and watch an injustice, even when getting involved meant putting herself at risk. Are you going to turn me over to Sheriff Bean? I'm going to protect my daughter, Judge Whitmore said firmly. But Eleanor, you need to understand that your involvement with Morrison has put us both in danger. If he's right about the corruption, then the people we're dealing with won't hesitate to harm us to protect themselves. Their conversation was interrupted by another soft knock at the door, 3 short taps followed by 2 longer ones. Eleanor recognized the pattern from Jake's note and felt her pulse quicken. Stay back, Judge Whitmore whispered, drawing a small pistol from his coat. Who's there? Someone who has information about Judge Blackwood that you need to hear, came the reply in a voice Eleanor recognized instantly. Judge Whitmore looked at his daughter sharply. Is that Jake Morrison? Eleanor confirmed. And father, I think you should listen to what he has to say. Judge Whitmore stared at the door for a long moment, weighing duty against curiosity, law against justice. Finally he reached for the door handle. This conversation never happened, he said quietly, then opened the door to admit the most wanted man in Arizona territory. Jake Morrison stepped into the hotel room like a man walking into a lion's den. He was clean-shaven and wearing the clothes of a respectable businessman rather than his usual outlaw attire, but there was no mistaking his identity or the aura of controlled danger that surrounded him. Judge Whitmore, he said formally, thank you for hearing me out. And Miss Whitmore. His eyes met Eleanor's and she saw gratitude, concern, and something deeper that made her heart race. Thank you for saving my life. Mr. Morrison, Judge Whitmore replied stiffly, you realize I should arrest you right now. Yes, sir, you should. But if you do, Judge Blackwood and Sheriff Bean will make sure I never make it to trial. And the evidence of their corruption will die with me. What evidence? Jake reached slowly into his coat, careful not to make any sudden movements that might alarm the federal judge. He withdrew a leather portfolio and placed it on the small table near the window. Documents proving that Judge Blackwood took bribes in at least a dozen cases, including my father's. Bank records showing payments from land speculators and mining interests, and testimony from witnesses who were threatened or paid to give false evidence. Judge Whitmore approached the portfolio cautiously, keeping his pistol ready. As he opened it and began examining the contents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "I've been collecting them for 6 years," Jake replied. "Every robbery, every job my gang pulled, was designed to get closer to the men who destroyed my family. I needed evidence that would stand up in a court of law." Eleanor watched her father study the documents, seeing his legal mind assess their validity and significance. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, he looked up at Jake with new respect. "This is substantial," he admitted. "If these documents are genuine, they represent evidence of criminal conspiracy on a scale I hadn't imagined." "They're genuine," Jake said simply. "And Judge, there's something else you need to know. The ambush that was set for me tonight, it wasn't about bringing me to justice. It was about making sure I never got the chance to present this evidence." Judge Whitmore set down the documents and studied Jake's face intently. "You're saying that law enforcement officials in this territory are actively working to prevent me from doing my job?" "Yes, sir. And they won't stop with me. If they suspect that Miss Whitmore helped me escape that trap, they'll use that against you. They'll claim that your daughter is consorting with criminals, that your judgment is compromised, that you're unfit to serve as a federal judge." Eleanor felt a chill at Jake's words, recognizing the truth in them. By helping him, she had inadvertently put her father's mission in jeopardy. "Then what do you suggest?" Judge Whitmore asked. "Give me 24 hours to get my men to safety," Jake replied. "Then use this evidence to clean house. Arrest Blackwood, Bean, and their accomplices. I'll surrender to you personally and testify against them in court." "And if I refuse?" Jake's smile was sad but determined. "Then I'll disappear into Mexico and you'll spend the rest of your time in Arizona fighting a corrupt system without the evidence you need to defeat it." "And Eleanor?" He looked at her with eyes that held a world of regret. "Eleanor will always be in danger from men who see her as a threat to their power." Judge Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the moral and legal complexities of the situation. Finally, he holstered his pistol and extended his hand to Jake. 24 hours, he said. "After that, I expect you to honor your word." "You have it," Jake replied, shaking the judge's hand. "And Judge, thank you for giving justice a chance to prevail over politics." As Jake prepared to leave, Eleanor stepped forward impulsively. "Be careful," she said softly. "There are bounty hunters everywhere, and Bean's men will be looking for you." "I will," Jake promised. "And Eleanor, after tomorrow when all this is over, I'd like to talk to you about the future. If you'll have me." Before Eleanor could respond, Jake was gone, disappearing into the tombstone night like the shadow his nickname suggested. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the empty street and wondering if she would ever see him alive again. "Eleanor," her father said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing, because tomorrow is going to change everything, for all of us." Eleanor nodded, her hand unconsciously touching the locket at her throat. Tomorrow would indeed change everything. The question was whether those changes would bring justice and love, or tragedy and loss. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor realized that for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, she felt truly alive. She had found her purpose, her cause, and perhaps most importantly, she had found her heart's true north in the form of a man who embodied all the contradictions and possibilities of the American frontier. The die was cast and there was no turning back now. The 24 hours that followed Jake Morrison's midnight meeting with Judge Whitmore were among the most tense and dangerous in Tombstone's brief but violent history. Word had somehow leaked that something big was brewing, and the town buzzed with rumors and speculation. Sheriff Bean returned from his failed ambush at Ghost Canyon in a foul mood, made worse by the growing whispers that his corruption was about to be exposed. Judge Blackwood had arrived in town ostensibly for routine court business, but everyone knew he was really there to coordinate damage control. Eleanor spent the morning helping her father prepare arrest warrants and organize loyal law enforcement officers from outside the immediate area. Federal marshals had been summoned from Tucson and Phoenix, men whose integrity was beyond question. "Are you sure about this, Father?" Eleanor asked as they worked in the courthouse's back room, safely away from prying eyes and ears. Once you move against Blackwood and Bean, there's no going back. I've been sure since I read Morrison's evidence, Judge Whitmore replied grimly. The scope of the corruption is staggering, Eleanor. They've perverted justice for their own profit, destroyed innocent lives, and turned the law into a weapon for their own greed. As the afternoon wore on, tension in Tombstone reached a breaking point. Federal marshals took up discreet positions around the town, while Bean's men gathered at the Crystal Palace saloon, clearly preparing for trouble. At exactly 4 o'clock as planned, Jake Morrison rode slowly down Allen Street toward the courthouse. He was alone, his hands visible and empty, but Eleanor could see the tension in every line of his body. This was either going to be the beginning of justice or the end of Jake Morrison. A crowd gathered as word spread that the infamous outlaw was surrendering. Some people called for immediate hanging, while others seemed curious about this unexpected development. Eleanor watched from the courthouse window, her heart in her throat. Judge Whitmore emerged from the building flanked by 2 federal marshals. Jake Morrison, he called out in a voice that carried clearly through the desert air, you are under arrest for robbery, cattle rustling, and various other charges. Do you surrender yourself to the jurisdiction of this court? I do, Your Honor, Jake replied formally, dismounting and walking toward the courthouse steps with his hands raised. It was at that moment that Sheriff Bean chose to make his move. Hold on there, Judge, he shouted, emerging from the saloon with 6 armed men. Morrison's my prisoner. I've been tracking him for months. Sheriff Bean, Judge Whitmore replied calmly, Mr. Morrison has surrendered to federal authority. He will be processed through this court. I don't think so, Bean snarled, his hand moving to his gun. Morrison's got a date with a rope, not a trial. The standoff that followed seemed to last forever. 2 groups of armed men faced each other in the dusty street, while townspeople dove for cover. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as she watched the drama unfold. It was Judge Blackwood who broke the silence, emerging from the courthouse behind Judge Whitmore. What's the meaning of this disturbance? He demanded in his most authoritative voice. Judge Blackwood, Judge Whitmore said without turning around, you're under arrest for corruption, bribery, and conspiracy. The words hit the assembled crowd like a thunderclap. Judge Blackwood's face went white, then red with rage. You can't arrest me. I'm a territorial judge. Not anymore, Judge Whitmore replied, nodding to the federal marshals who moved to flank Blackwood. Your commission has been revoked by order of the territorial governor. What happened next would be talked about in Tombstone for decades. Sheriff Bean, realizing that his protector was finished, went for his gun in a desperate attempt to fight his way out of the situation. Jake Morrison, despite being technically under arrest, threw himself between the sheriff and Judge Whitmore, taking a bullet in the shoulder as he shielded the federal judge from Bean's wild shot. The street erupted in gunfire as federal marshals exchanged shots with Bean's corrupt deputies. When the smoke cleared 30 seconds later, Sheriff Bean lay dead in the dust, along with 3 of his men. The others had surrendered or fled. Eleanor rushed from the courthouse to where Jake lay bleeding in the street, Judge Whitmore kneeling beside him. How bad is it? She asked, her medical training taking over despite her emotional turmoil. Through and through, Jake gasped, managing a weak smile. I've had worse. Dr. Goodfellow arrived within minutes, summoned by the sound of gunfire. As he worked to stabilize Jake's wound, he looked up at Judge Whitmore with something approaching awe. Judge, what you did today took more courage than most men possess. Cleaning out this nest of corruption couldn't have been easy. It wouldn't have been possible without Mr. Morrison's evidence, Judge Whitmore replied, watching as Eleanor helped the doctor bandage Jake's shoulder. And it certainly wouldn't have been possible without his willingness to surrender and testify. Over the following days, as Jake recovered from his wound in the town jail, which Dr. Goodfellow had insisted was the safest place for him, the full extent of the corruption scandal became clear. Judge Blackwood's records revealed bribery, land fraud, and judicial misconduct on a massive scale. More importantly for Jake personally, new evidence emerged that completely exonerated his father. Documents hidden in Blackwood's safe proved that the elder Morrison had been framed by Sheriff Wilson and his associates, who had wanted the Morrison Ranch for its strategic location and water rights. Your father was completely innocent, Judge Whitmore told Jake during one of their daily meetings in the jail. The charges against him were fabricated, the witnesses were paid to lie, and the evidence was planted. You have my word that his name will be cleared completely. Eleanor visited Jake every day, bringing him books, decent food, and updates on the ongoing legal proceedings. Their conversations ranged from serious discussions about justice and the law to lighter topics that revealed their growing affection for each other. "What will you do when this is all over?" Eleanor asked during one such visit. "I honestly don't know," Jake admitted. "I've been an outlaw for 6 years. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." "You could be anything you wanted," Eleanor said earnestly. "You have education, intelligence, natural leadership abilities. You could be a lawyer, a rancher, a businessman." "Could I be the husband of a federal judge's daughter?" Jake asked quietly. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "Is that what you want?" "More than anything," Jake replied, reaching through the bars to take her hand. "But Eleanor, you need to understand what you'd be getting into. I'll always be the man who rode with the Crimson Riders. Some people will never let me forget that. And you need to understand that I don't care what other people think," Eleanor replied firmly. "I've seen your heart, Jake Morrison. I've seen the man you really are beneath the outlaw reputation. That's the man I love." The word hung in the air between them, the first time either had openly acknowledged the depth of their feelings. Jake raised Eleanor's hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I love you too," he said simply. "More than I thought possible." Their romantic moment was interrupted by the arrival of Judge Whitmore, who was carrying a large leather folder and wearing an expression Eleanor had never seen before. Something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction mixed with paternal pride. "Mr. Morrison," he said formally, "I have some news that I think will interest you greatly." Jake stood as much as his chains would allow, his face curious but guarded. "The territorial governor has reviewed your case in light of the new evidence regarding your father's innocence and your cooperation in exposing the corruption scandal," Judge Whitmore continued. "He has agreed to commute your sentence to time served, contingent on your testimony in the upcoming trials." Jake stared at the judge in disbelief. "You mean I'm free?" "As of tomorrow morning, yes. There will be conditions, of course. You'll need to remain in the territory until all the trials are concluded, and you'll be required to make restitution for some of your activities. But yes, Mr. Morrison, you're a free man." Eleanor felt tears of joy streaming down her face as the full implications sank in. Jake would be free, free to start over, free to build a new life, free to love her without the shadow of the gallows hanging over them. "There's one more thing," Judge Whitmore added, his stern expression softening slightly. "The territorial legislature is creating a new position, Special Territorial Investigator, someone to root out corruption in remote areas where federal authority is limited. The job would involve travel, some danger, and the need to work with both law enforcement and, shall we say, unconventional sources of information. The governor wondered if you might be interested." Jake's eyes widened as he realized what was being offered. A chance to use his knowledge of the territory's criminal underworld in service of justice rather than personal revenge. An opportunity to truly start over while still making use of the skills and connections he had developed during his outlaw years. "I would be very interested," he said formally. "Good. Oh, and Mr. Morrison?" Judge Whitmore's eyes twinkled with barely suppressed amusement. "The position comes with a substantial salary and excellent benefits. Quite sufficient to support a wife, should you be fortunate enough to find a woman willing to marry a reformed outlaw." Eleanor looked at her father in amazement. "Father, are you giving him permission to court me?" "I'm giving him permission to try," Judge Whitmore replied. "Whether he succeeds or not is entirely up to you, my dear." Jake reached through the bars again, taking both of Eleanor's hands in his. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I know I'm not what your family probably imagined for you, but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." Eleanor's answer was to stand on her tiptoes and kiss him through the jail bars, scandalizing several passing townspeople but delighting her father, who had grown to respect Jake Morrison more than he had ever expected possible. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." 6 months later, the wedding of Eleanor Whitmore and Jake Morrison was held in the newly completed Tombstone Community Church. The ceremony was attended by what one newspaper called the most unusual collection of guests in Arizona Territory history. Federal marshals sat alongside reformed outlaws. Territorial officials shared pews with Apache scouts who had worked with Jake during his investigations. Dr. Goodfellow served as Jake's best man, while Martha Peterson, the mysterious woman who had helped coordinate Eleanor's warning about Ghost Canyon, stood as Eleanor's matron of honor. Even Red Murphy and the other former members of the Crimson Riders were present, having been pardoned in exchange for their cooperation in the ongoing corruption trials. Red had taken a job as a deputy marshal, while Tommy the Kid Williams was attending the Territorial University, funded by a scholarship established with money recovered from the corruption scandal. Judge Whitmore performed the ceremony himself, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church as he pronounced Jake and Eleanor husband and wife. As they kissed to seal their vows, the assembled guests erupted in cheers that could be heard throughout Tombstone. The reception was held at the Grand Hotel, where Jake and Eleanor had first encountered each other during his surrender 6 months earlier. As they danced to music provided by a surprisingly talented band of former outlaws and reformed lawmen, Eleanor marveled at how much their lives had changed. "Any regrets?" Jake asked as they swayed together on the makeshift dance floor. "Only one," Eleanor replied, smiling up at her new husband. "I regret that it took a stagecoach robbery to bring us together. We wasted so much time we could have spent getting to know each other." "I don't know about that," Jake said thoughtfully. "I think we both needed to go through what we did to become the people we are today. You needed to learn that justice isn't always found in law books, and I needed to learn that revenge isn't the same thing as justice." Eleanor considered this, then nodded. "You're probably right. And besides, our story will certainly make interesting telling for our grandchildren someday." "Speaking of children," Jake said, pulling her closer, "how do you feel about the idea of raising a family in Arizona Territory? It's still a dangerous place with plenty of challenges ahead." "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be," Eleanor replied honestly. "This territory is growing, changing, becoming something new. We can be part of that growth, help shape what it becomes. Besides," she added with a mischievous smile, "where else could a federal judge's daughter marry a reformed outlaw and have it turn out to be a respectable match?" Jake laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Only in America, I suppose. Only on the frontier, where a man can reinvent himself and a woman can choose her own destiny." As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Jake and Eleanor stood together on the hotel's front porch, looking out over the town that had brought them together. Tombstone was quieter now, more civilized, but it still retained the sense of possibility that had drawn people from across the nation to this remote corner of Arizona Territory. "What do you think the future holds for us?" Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder. "Adventure," Jake replied without hesitation. "Justice, well, and probably more excitement than either of us bargained for." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the work that lay ahead. Jake's new position as special territorial investigator would take them throughout the Southwest, working to establish law and order in places where federal authority was still more theoretical than real. It wouldn't be an easy life, but it would be a meaningful one. "I love you, Jake Morrison," she said softly. "And I love you, Eleanor Morrison," he replied, still marveling at the sound of her married name. As they stood there in the desert moonlight, neither could have imagined that their love story would become the stuff of legend, a tale told around campfires and in saloons throughout the West for generations to come. The stagecoach robbery that had sparked their forbidden love had indeed changed both their lives, but more than that, it had helped change the very nature of justice in the American frontier. Years later, when Jake Morrison had become one of the most respected lawmen in the Southwest and Eleanor had established schools throughout the territory, people would still talk about the outlaw who chose love over revenge and the judge's daughter who chose her heart over convention. But on that moonlit night in Tombstone, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds, ready to face whatever the future might bring together. And in the end, that was all that really mattered: love, justice, and the courage to follow one's heart, even when the path led through the dust and danger of the untamed American West. Their story became part of the great American legend of the frontier, where ordinary people could become heroes, where second chances were always possible, and where love could indeed conquer all, even the seemingly impossible gulf between an outlaw and a lady. The stagecoach robbery that had brought them together was just the beginning of their adventure. The rest of their story would be written together, one day at a time, across the vast and beautiful landscape of the American Southwest, where dreams could come true for those brave enough to chase them.